need God's word more than ever before. I can tell you that in talking to people that have really been affected and have lost loved ones or have loved ones in a very critical position, the thing that sustains them is the character of God and what they know about him through his word. And this is why we need his word more and more and more. So let's get into his word now, because that's what we need. Turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. I love this passage that we're about to jump into, just so you know. And I'm excited to be there with you. So as a way of introduction, how do you view God's interactions with us? How do you view how God is interacting in your life and in my life? And I know we've been looking through this lens of gospel mission, right? We've been looking through the book of Acts as saying, what is God up to? The advancement of his purposes and mission here on earth. And we will see that again today, but I ask you, how do you view God's interaction with us? There's basically kind of two views out there that most people have, and one of them is the watchmaker view, right? It's a very deistic view of God. That God kind of made the earth, got all the little details figured out, and then set it up and kind of backed off. Or do you have the opposite view of that, what I would call the intimate view of God, the personal interaction of God in our daily lives? And I think it's important that you and I have an answer for that. And I want you to know that our answer is not going to probably come by what we say with our mouth. How do you view God's interaction with you and me? How do you view God's interaction on accomplishing the gospel purposes in our world? Is he a watchmaker, or is he intimately involved? And our answer to that will be demonstrated by how we respond with our actions. And so I want to push us through this passage today and bring a sense of encouragement that God demonstrates that he is personally involved and that he greatly cares to work through our life and your life and every circumstance to do things that you and I could never comprehend or understand. This is an exciting section that we're in. Acts chapter 10, really through verse 11, chapter 11, verse 18, is with the longest narrative portion in the book of Acts. I just want to read something about this because I think it's going to begin to show you. We have a 3-part series here in this narrative of why we should be excited to be here. The 10th chapter of Acts. This is James Montgomery Boyce. The 10th chapter of Acts is one of the most important chapters in Acts. Perhaps also one of the most important chapters in all the Bible. Why is it so important? Why? Because God shows us that he practically intervenes through his revelation to do something theologically significant for the whole world. Gentiles should be especially thankful for this chapter. Gentiles is anyone who's not a Jew. Especially thankful for this chapter, since it is because of this revelation that they are also able to come to God, even though Gentiles. And so this section here is an exciting section. It is the breakthrough. It is the divine push by God to extend the gospel out to the world. And this text that we have today talks about prayer and responding to the Spirit and of providence and of transformation of a Gentile and of a righteous Jewish man. And next week it will speak to us about prejudices and personal things that you and I tend to struggle with in our lives. And this is a beautiful story of God's amazing grace in saving a sinner and sanctifying a saint. And so the title for today's message is The Providential Steps in Saving a Sinner and sanctifying a saint. And so I'm really excited about it. So if you'll open there to Acts chapter 10, we're going to begin. The first portion we're going to take a look at and then make some sub-points out of is called Cornelius's vision. And it's verses 1 through 8. So I'm going to read the text now, and then we'll begin to unpack some points. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people, and he prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius?" And he stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea." And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, this is now Cornelius responding, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having relayed everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. So this is the beginning of our text. So we see in the very beginning a guy named Cornelius, and so we see the chapter open up with an introduction of one of God's sheep who is from another fold, right? That's John 10. And so the first subpoint under this, or A, is religious but lost. So what do you mean by that, Chago? Well, we see that this guy Cornelius is a religious man. And I would tell you in a very favorable and positive way. He is described as being devout, okay? That means in the Greek that he was a godly man. And I would say that his religion was one that was focused on the religion that had been given or that he had seen in the Jewish people. And that took a big step for people to do that. He had to renounce pagan religions. He had to renounce other forms of worship that was around him and say, no, there's something about the Jewish people that is attractive to me, that I see in them, that I'm going to move towards. And so he is believing in the God of the Jews. Now, he also is a very prominent man. To be a centurion, you've heard the word century, right? Means that he was in charge of over 100 men. And this is going to get onto some historical weeds, and I don't want to be long today. So I'm going to try to skip some of the detail stuff. But basically there was a group of you would have a group of about 600 soldiers that would be kind of in this battalion group, and then they would be broken up by 100, and the person who was in charge of that big old large platoon of 100 people was called a centurion. And so he was a very influential man. And even we'll see next week, he was very influential in sharing his beliefs. Because when he went, just as a hint, to send men to obey what God had showed him in a vision, he sent 2 servants, and he also sent a soldier. So he was influencing other people in a very positive way. And you're going to find out when Peter finally shows up and hangs out with Cornelius, there's a whole bunch of people waiting when Peter shows up to hear the gospel presentation. And so what is missing in this thing? Why do I say he is religious but lost? It's because the whole point of what is taking place in this narrative is that God is going to bring this centurion, to have a confrontation in a sense with a gospel heralder who is Peter. And so you see this taking off. What was missing in his religion is that he did not know Messiah yet. He did not know what Jesus had accomplished and done. And so this was what God is doing. He is taking this very religious, very devout man and bringing them together. And I just want to highlight the aspect of his prayer, because that's kind of some takeaways we're going to get at the end. But look at the fact that he prayed. And the word for prayer here in the Greek means to be begging or beseeching. And God had done such a work of grace in this guy's life that he was continually begging and beseeching God for something. And God said that your prayers have come up to me as a memorial. And so God chose to be so kind and gracious to him. And I think you begin to get the heart of who this guy is by the response that he gives, that he has after the vision. And he says, "What is it, Lord? What is it, Lord?" So neat. So he's a religious man, but I want you to know that he is lost. The B in this section is lost but loved. Lost but loved. Why is God doing it this way, right? What is God up to in doing it this way? Why give this vision? He can save Cornelius any way he wants, right? He can arrest his attention. He can share, the truth about Christ, but he's up to something here, and he's connecting these dots. And I want you to know that I think God is trying to connect people. I think this is one of the reasons why God has called you and I to be ambassadors for him. God is up to larger transformations and larger projects than just going to someone and going, "I'm going to save you. I'm going to give you a new life and a new heart." God is connecting people. God is doing something very large and grand here, and you're going to see that in just a little bit. And the gospel mission has been declared by God to come through the Jews to the Gentiles. We see that in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And so somebody has to make this thing happen. And I think for you and I to feel the weight of what God is doing, we need to go to Ephesians chapter 3. So go there, open your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 3. And it says in verse 1, "For this reason I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ, Jesus, on behalf of you Gentiles, assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you, how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have written briefly. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ." So Paul is saying that God has stewarded me with a certain aspect, with a certain mission. And that mystery, this thing here, is that there's a mystery aspect to Jesus that I've been in charge of or stewarded to give out. Verse 5, "Which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit." That's so important, by the Spirit. Verse 6, "This mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, and partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel." What a big deal. And so God has had this awesome thing in Jesus, this mystery, this unfolding of an amazing plan that other generations just did not appreciate, that they did not recognize. I would not say that they didn't fully know, right? We know that the Jews were going to bless all nations through the seed that Abraham was a part of. So we know that they knew about it, but they did not understand it, how it would unfold, and how it would all ultimately happen. And so there's this unfolding going on that is grand. The scale of it is beyond anything you and I could ever understand. It is far more big, right? But I want to also note that as God is trying to connect all of these people and to do this grand thing, things are also quite personal as well. And I love this. "The good shepherd loves his sheep, and he searches for them, and he calls to them." Cornelius was given the grace of longing for God. And God reached out to him and was going to personally respond to him. And I just love that when we think about gospel mission, right? And we think about gospel proclamation, and we think about advancing the church, the grand scale of it is just overwhelming. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation will bow their knee one day and say, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain." What a marvelous thing to think about. But in the midst of all that, it's also very, very personal and very, very intimate. And that's what we learn about this first section. And that takes us to the second section here, which is Peter's vision, which is verses 9 through 23. And this is kind of broken up into three parts. And the first part, the big A, under this section, is God's servant. This is verses 9 through 13. Let's read that together. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. There he is praying again. We're going to tie this together later. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance, and saw the heavens open and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And in this first part here, I want us to appreciate that Peter was on mission for God. Okay? And that's highlighted to us in the fact that he's praying, and I'll bring that up in a little bit. But we didn't preach on the last section of chapter 9. If you would kind of go there, you'll see that there are two small miracles that take place under the hand of Peter's ministry. And many people kind of say that this part with Cornelius that we're in today, it's kind of like a 3-chapter vision of Peter's ministry. And so he heals somebody, he works with somebody, he's bringing the gospel, he's being faithful, and now we're dealing here with Cornelius and Peter being connected to the Gentile world. But I just want us to all understand that Peter is a godly servant of God, that he is trying to obey God, trying to serve God, and yet, even though he is God's servant, God has to come into his life in a radical way to do some things. And so there's this vision, right? I think all of us can appreciate or connect with this, right? When we haven't eaten, some of you have had visions as well, right? Whether it's to strangle somebody or get hangry. I'm joking. But when you're hungry, you're ready to eat. And so who knows what's going on in Peter's mind, but he goes to pray. He's waiting for them to make the lunch. And when he's up there, God speaks to him and shows him this vision of a curtain coming down full of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And in it, the response in his hunger, Jesus says to him, "Peter, kill and eat." And I think the thing that God is trying to teach Peter right now, or that I want you and I to see in a sense, is that here is a godly man that still has lessons to learn. And we're going to see next week specifically what that lesson is, and the week after that. But God is using Peter, and he's a godly man, and he's growing in so many ways. Yet God intervenes in his time of prayer, in his time of connecting with God, and God responds to him. And so that leads us kind of to, once I establish that foundation, he is a godly servant. He's being faithful. He's on mission. He's doing things for the Lord. B is righteous but confused. And we're going to read that in verses 14 through 18. But Peter said, after he saw this vision, and God says, "Kill and eat it," "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times. So Peter was having a hard time, right? He's a righteous man, but he's confused. And God is telling him to do something that he has never imagined doing, right? And God is working on him and trying to communicate to him. And this is what he does now. This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate and called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. Now, it's fascinating to note the response of the both visions. In Cornelius' case, he says, "What is it, Lord?" In Peter's case, it is, "By no means, Lord." And I don't know about you, but this is just so Peter, right? He's the guy that would cut an ear off, and they might deny you, I never will. It's just part of his personality. I think that's what you're seeing. And it's part of his faithfulness too, right? I've tried to always obey what the scriptures have taught. I've never wanted to eat an unclean thing. I've never had, bacon. I've never had shellfish. And so here God is telling him to eat some of these things. And it's really shocking him. It's a perplexing message. But please note, this is important. Look how God answered his confusion. God spoke to him. He did it 3 times. He was having a hard time comprehending it. The Lord gave Peter a disorienting vision, but didn't explain the meaning of it. Peter was perplexed, and he pondered the meaning of it. And as he was pondering the meaning of it, the Spirit instructed him. At some point, not immediately, he began to piece things together so that when he meets Cornelius later, he will know what is going on. And so I think it's important to see that the Spirit in his perplexity is speaking to him, clarifying things to him. Here's a righteous man who is confused. And I just don't think you and I can understand how confused you and I would be. It's just overwhelming to be told something that has been ingrained in you culturally and all your life, and it's so challenging. But he's a righteous person, but he's confused, but he's willing to listen to the Spirit and what the Spirit is teaching him and explaining to him. And so that leads to our third point. He's confused, but he's correctable. And this is verses 19 through 23. Let's read those as well. And while Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them." And Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you're looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" And they said, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So he invited them in to be his guest. Now, I think this is so critical for you and I to see the working of the Spirit, the working of prayer, to be challenged on some things. God is doing a massive work. Not only bringing salvation and breaking through to the Gentile world, but I get back to this big thing, this huge historical thing that you and I, can at times can't wrap our head around, also becomes quite personal. And so God is working on Peter. See, Peter could not imagine thinking about life differently. And you and I don't think, can appreciate the gulf that there was between the Jew and the Gentile. John Stott helps me with this. It's difficult for us to grasp the impassable gulf which yawned in those days between the Jews on the one hand and the Gentiles on the other. They knew they were to be the blessing one day for them, but sadly the tragedy was that Israel twisted this doctrine of election into one of favoritism. They became filled with racial pride and hatred, despised the Gentiles as dogs, and developed traditions that kept them apart. No Orthodox Jew would ever enter the home of a Gentile. Ever. 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 And when you hear this from a scholar, you get an idea of wow, there's a bigger chasm here between Jew and Gentile than you and I can fathom. And God has to do an amazing work in a righteous person like Peter, who is on mission for God, being faithful to God, but yet he needs to be sanctified. He needs to grow. He needs to be changed. And I sympathize with Peter, because I think all of us have things in us that at times God needs to purge out of us. Tim Keller says, often we struggle to see our own sin. He goes, know that your worst character flaws are the ones you can see the least. Did you ever think about that? The worst character flaws that you and I have are the ones that we see the least. He goes on to say, sadly, you and I can't learn about our flaws by just being told. Often we have to be shown. And so I think what you see in Peter here, this confused, but he's correctable. He's being challenged. And we're going to really dig into the prejudice piece next week. But immediately you see someone who's willing to submit to God and to respond and to obey. And there's people at your door. Go down there, be with them. And we're going to see that he leaves with these men next week to do what God has for him to do. And so I love the big things that are taking place. And in verse 23, when he lets them into his home, I found this to be really encouraging. Peter invited them and gave them lodging. He says, the world history that you and I know of today was hinging on this verse. Let me make a case today that world history stood in the balance as Simon Peter stood at that threshold, found 3 Gentiles at the door, and he did the unlawful thing. He invited them in. What an amazing thing that took place at that moment. And so, again, we see this good man that God is using, but he's needing salvation. And you see a man who is saved, right? Who is needing sanctification. And yet God is doing something really big, above their comprehension, through their faithfulness, through their prayers, and through their obedience. And so I want to kind of end with some application for you and for me, if you don't mind. I want to talk about praying in the Spirit. These men are being used by God, are being connected to a grand mission, but it's through prayer. These visions, these moments with the Spirit came through prayer. And I think we need to understand what God is doing through prayer. And I want to go to Jesus on prayer, if you don't mind. No one is better to instruct us on prayer than Jesus himself. He prays all over the place. At the Transfiguration, when he selects the disciples, at the Last Supper, during the Passover feast, before his arrest, even on the cross, he prays and demonstrates that for us. But there is a lesson for us, and you might want to look into this further. I'm going to send a link on our Facebook page of Rabbi Zacharias' article on prayer. And this is where I got some of these things that were really neat. And in Luke chapter 11, verse 13, that whole section is, they learned the Lord's Prayer, our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Gets to the end of that, says, if you earthly fathers know how to give good gifts, how much more will your heavenly Father give you all good things? And at the end of that, verse 13, Jesus teaching us about prayer says this, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? And it says, on the heels of the Lord's Prayer, and as his conclusion to it, Jesus tells us that God will give the Holy Spirit, his indwelling presence, to those who ask for it. That is the whole point of prayer. It is not spoken in the form of a question. It ends with an exclamation point. God will give the gift of the indwelling presence of the Holy God to anyone who asks for it. This is absolute certain. That's from Rabbi Zacharias. See, I think one of the things that you and I need so much in our prayer life is to be asking God to be filled with the Holy Spirit, to be willing to listen, to have God communicate and do exactly what Peter did. Ponder this perplexing thing that God is kind of doing in our hearts, right? Because I think that's how God works. How many of us knew that when you get to the teaching on prayer by Jesus, that one of the main things that he says that you must be going towards is being asked to be indwelt fully by the Holy Spirit. See, one of the things that God is doing in prayer is that He's changing us. You can count on it. God is working in and through prayer to do amazing things. And I know there's a lot of difficulty, right, of understanding prayer. Me even praying for people right now. Me praying for many people that have people in the hospital or people that are dealing with funerals. And I'm praying, God, what's your will here? What do you want to do? But I think it's important to note that God is up to very interesting things in prayer. And Cornelius was a person who prayed, and Peter was a person who prayed, and then God used them as instruments for His mission to do amazing things. But I think one of the things that God is doing is transforming us to letting God be Lord. See, we struggle to let God be the boss, to let God call the shots. You know why you and I struggle to obey? Because we don't pray enough. See, the more that we pray, the more that we seek the Holy Spirit, the more the Lord is going to show up and get to be the boss. Later on in verse 36, you don't have to go there, but it says, "As for the word that He sent to Israel, preaching good news of peace through Jesus Christ, He is Lord of all." And when Peter begins to unpack the gospel, he's telling them that I obey God. He's the master. He's the boss. Cornelius has obeyed God. And what God is ultimately up to is all of us letting God be Lord. This is one of the essences or the goals, I think, of people who are intimately in prayer with God. Prayer is us making God the Lord. Let me read this thing from the article. This is one of the most defining differences between an apologist who is merely interested in arguments and an apologist who knows God in a clear and personal walk with Him. So this is Ravi talking about apologetics. To the skeptic, to say that prayer is more about the lordship of Christ than it is about getting answers may seem at first blush to be evasive, but it's not. And so do you see what he's saying? Ravi is saying, prayer is about us getting to a place where we make God Lord, even over getting answers, even over figuring everything out, right? It's about God getting to be boss. And so this is what God is doing through prayer. He's going to use us for His mission and purposes, but He's about changing us. About changing you, about changing me. And that leads me to the second takeaway. Not only prayer, but providence. This orchestration that is taking place in this passage is really amazing to me. What is providence? Let me again give you a textbook definition here. Divine providence is the governance of God by which He, with wisdom, love, cares for and directs all things in the universe. The doctrine of divine providence asserts that God is in complete control of all things. Through divine providence, God is accomplishing His perfect will. And so, when you read this story of Cornelius and Peter, they didn't know each other. They didn't know what was happening in their lives. There was no awareness in Peter of this faith, this man who was seeking God in faith, who was having a religious influence on other people. These Gentiles that were warm and ready for gospel presentation. Peter didn't know that. And Peter would have just kept going around and talking to more people that were more like him. But little did he know that God was providentially working all of these things out. I mean, the details are amazing. As they were entering the city, as he's in the middle of his prayers, he's in the middle of his reflection, they come to the door. There's a knock. I mean, the list goes on and on about how God is providentially working out all of these things. And so one commentator says, this is a beautiful example, this text, of the mysterious comforting truth of divine providence. And so we clearly get a glimpse of the mysterious ways of God by which He works all things after the counsel of His will. Ephesians 1:11. For in this section, He was working simultaneously, I like this, on the heart of Cornelius, and at the same time on the heart of Peter. And so in Acts chapters 10 and 11, we encounter one of the most illustrative examples of God's providence at work as we see his supernatural activities occurring in two separate cities to assure that the gospel goes forth. Every time I meditate deeply on the providence of God, I have great comfort. Because God is doing everything that he has set out and planned to do. And God is going to use you and me to participate in that. To be an instrument in that providential working to accomplish his grand purposes, right? Of saving people, of saving your brother, of saving your neighbor, of saving your coworker, of saving your son, of saving your daughter. God is providentially allowing that to take place. It's an amazing thing. God works even in a man who has an unregenerate heart, in Cornelius. God is working in a saved heart, someone who has the Spirit in him, and God is working as well in that. And so I want us to connect these two things together. I want more prayer in my life. I want to pray now more according to knowledge than ever before. God, fill me with your Spirit. Make me sensitive to what you're doing. God, give eyes to people in their communities, in their home, with their loved ones about what you are up to in this gospel mission. About what you are orchestrating right now, God. So as you're changing me and as you're working in me, how is that tied to me advancing the gospel to somebody else? That's the connection I want to make with you today. That God is up to changing people. You and me. And I want to encourage you with that, dear Redeemer. There is, I think, a far more deeper connection between the Spirit and our witness than we could ever understand. God speaks to us primarily through his word, yes. He directs our ways, often in ways that we could never expect. God is up to something good. I want to read a quick little testimony as we end. Gary Daughtry, a co-worker for RBC Ministries, was walking home from church one evening when he saw a young man coming from the opposite direction. A strong urge came over Gary to talk with him about becoming a Christian. Something prompted Gary to go, I need to tell that guy about Jesus. Watch this. He hesitated at first, but then he said to this total stranger, pardon me, but I believe, as crazy as this sounds, that God wants me to tell you how to become a Christian. This is the guy's response. I just literally asked my girlfriend's mother that very question, but she didn't know. Gary goes, you mean you want to become a Christian? I do, he replied. Still incredulous, Gary asked him again and then shared the plan of salvation with him. That night, that young man met Jesus as his Savior. Is this a coincidence? I think not. What a parallel that we see that is happening in Acts chapter 10. God is preparing hearts, moving hearts, changing you, changing me, so that we would be, right, those frontline people about sharing and giving the gospel away. And so I think of this little hymn. Father, thank you for your Spirit. Fill us with his love and power. Change us into Christ's image day and day and hour by hour. We need to be transformed continually over and over again to be people that are sensitive to the Spirit. So my challenge for you is ask the Lord to open your heart to him. And I believe as the Lord opens your heart to him, he will open your eyes to the lost. That's just the way he works. And I'm really encouraged by this passage. Even you, some of you might be struggling because you're really discouraged because God has been working on your sin of being a liar. Or God is working on your sin of perversion or impure thoughts. And you're like, I keep falling back into that. I keep watching porn. I'm struggling with this, Lord. Help me put up a fight. little did you know that what God is purging in you might very well be like one of the instruments that God uses for you to connect the gospel to somebody else. And so God saves and he sanctifies, and he does this through our prayer, through the Spirit, and through providence. And that should give us great hope and confidence now that God is up to something good for the glory of his name and for our good. And so again, I can declare to you and end our service with this great admonition. And so we read the commission again. And Jesus came and he said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. What a great reminder. We get to be a part of this amazing, global, eternal plan that God has as he personally transforms you and me. So this week, let's pray, asking God to fill us with his Spirit and to give us eyes to see, give us names to pray for, right? Let's, this mission, let it become really personal, because God is personally invested in you as well. And so, church, now go be what you are. Be the church.
Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son,